In anticipation of World War II, the United States of America was going through the greatest economic crisis in its history, the Great Depression. The country was struggling with mass unemployment, reaching 25% at its peak, a collapse in industrial production, and widespread poverty. Factories were idle, farms were failing, and millions of people were living in extreme poverty, barely making ends meet. Society was demoralized, and few could have predicted that in less than a decade, America would become the world's leading economic power. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, and then Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, forcing the United States into the conflict, the country faced a task of enormous proportions. It was necessary not only to mobilize the army, but also to restructure the entire economy on a war footing, providing not only for its own needs, but also for the needs of its allies. Many experts doubted that the economy, exhausted by the Depression, could withstand such a burden. However, through a series of clever and sometimes truly revolutionary economic strategies, known as so-called tricks, the United States not only successfully met the challenge of war, but also transformed its economy, emerging from the conflict not just as a winner, but as a great world power with a very high level of prosperity and influence. Today we'll look at 5 key economic tricks which became the basis of the American military miracle. Namely, I will tell you in more detail about massive industrial mobilization, the Lend-Lease Act, government financing and investment, mass labor recruitment, and the war bond campaign. Each of these strategies played a unique role, but their combined impact was powerful and forever changed America's economic and social landscape. Let's take a closer look at how these steps transformed a country on its knees into the arsenal of democracy, ensuring victory and laying the foundation for post-war global governance. And we begin with the first factor in the massive mobilization of industry. This was the first, and even the most fundamental, trick. It was not simply an increase in production, but a complete transformation, which President Franklin Roosevelt called the creation of the arsenal of democracy. This process not only provided the Allies with the resources they needed to win, but it also essentially eliminated unemployment, pulling the country out of the Great Depression. By the early 1940s, the U.S. automobile industry was the most powerful and developed sector of the economy. However, it faced a seemingly impossible task. Instead of producing millions of passenger cars, it had to start producing tanks, airplanes, and military trucks in incredibly large quantities. An example is Ford and the Willow Run plant. This legendary Willow Run plant in Michigan, owned by Ford Motor Company, and is the most striking symbol of this transformation. Before the war, Henry Ford was skeptical about the idea of mass-producing airplanes, considering them too complex. However, under government pressure and because of the war's needs, Ford took on the project. The Willow Run plant, built in 1942, was designed to produce B-24 Liberator bombers on the principle of an automobile assembly line. At the peak of production in 1944, one B-24 bomber rolled off the assembly line every hour, or as many as 16 aircraft per day. It was a manufacturing marvel that demonstrated the incredible efficiency and adaptability of American industry. In all, more than 8,600 B-24 bombers were produced at Willow Run, accounting for about half of all U.S. production. But other giants, like General Motors and Chrysler, also switched their production lines. GM, the world's largest company at the time, produced not only Sherman tanks and hundreds of thousands of military trucks, but also aircraft engines, artillery pieces, and millions of rounds of ammunition. For example, GM's Michigan plant, famous for making Buicks, Cadillacs, and Chevrolets, began making parts for fighter jets and tanks. Chrysler produced thousands of tanks and also assembled aircraft engines. Even manufacturers of typewriters, sewing machines, and refrigerators switched to making guns, radios, mines, and other war materials. It is obvious that the coordination of such a gigantic transition required powerful state regulation. Therefore, in January of 1942, the War Production Committee was created. This body had broad powers. It controlled the distribution of scarce raw materials, such as steel, aluminum, copper, rubber, set production quotas, reoriented factories, and also decided on the rationing of civilian goods. The WPB ensured that military needs had priority over all others and directed resources to where they were most needed. It was an example of unconditional cooperation. between government and private business. In the end, the results of this widespread mobilization were truly impressive and exceeded the wildest expectations. Economists call this period the military miracle that effectively ended the Great Depression. It can be said that from 1939 to 1944, the US GDP grew by about 100%. This meant that the volume of goods and services produced doubled in less than 5 years. Industrial production increased by more than 90% during the same period. To understand the scale, let's look at some examples. In 1940, the United States produced only 2,200 military aircraft. By 1944, that figure had skyrocketed to 96,000. More than 88,000 tanks, 2.6 million machine guns, 6.5 million rifles, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition were also produced. American shipyards have built more than 6,000 warships, including aircraft carriers, destroyers, and transport ships. Liberty-class ships, which were produced at incredible speed, sometimes in less than 2 weeks. For example, Henry Kaiser, a famous industrialist, introduced such efficient shipbuilding methods that his shipyards became a symbol of speed and scale. But the most striking social change was the almost complete disappearance of unemployment. Whereas in 1933 it had reached 24.9%, and in 1939 it was still 17.2%. By 1944, the unemployment rate had fallen to an all-time low of 1.2%. This meant that anyone who wanted to work could find work. Millions of people who had been unemployed for years now had a stable income and felt needed. This led to a significant growth of the middle class and a strengthening of the financial position of the vast majority of American families. Incomes increased and savings grew, laying the foundation for the post-war consumer boom. It is worth remembering that it not only stimulated production, but also became a powerful engine of technological progress. The state, realizing the critical importance of technological excellence, invested huge amounts of money in scientific research. One of these was the Office of Scientific Research and Development, created in 1941, and led by the talented engineer and administrator Vannevar Bush. OSRD became the central body coordinating the nation's scientific efforts. It brought together thousands of scientists and engineers from universities, industry, and government laboratories. The results of its work were incredibly significant. Radar and sonar need to be mentioned because the development and improvement of these technologies was one of the most important advances that radically changed naval and air warfare, allowing the detection of enemies at a distance and in conditions of poor visibility. And after Japan occupied Southeast Asia, the United States lost access to 100% of the world's natural rubber, vital for the production of tires and other military materials. OSRD coordinated a massive program to create an industrial production of synthetic rubber, which became one of the engineering achievements of the war. In a few years, a whole new industry was created. Medical advances at the time, such as the rapid mass production of penicillin, which saved soldiers' lives. New vaccines, treatments for injuries, and blood transfusions were developed, significantly reducing battlefield mortality. But the most secret and significant OSRD project was the Manhattan Project, which culminated in the creation of the atomic bomb. This project, which cost billions of dollars and involved the efforts of thousands of scientists, demonstrated unprecedented capabilities for government funding, coordination, and organization of scientific research to achieve a specific goal. These innovations not only helped win the war, but also laid the foundation for the post-war technological breakthrough. New technologies, materials, and manufacturing processes developed during the war were the foundation of industries such as aviation, electronics, pharmaceuticals, and petrochemicals, giving the United States technological superiority for decades to come. The industrial complex built and modernized during the war became a powerful driving force for unprecedented economic growth after the war. Which brings us to the next trick, which involves the Lend-Lease Act. Passed in March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor was attacked and America entered the war, the act allowed the United States to provide vital material aid to the Allies without directly violating neutrality and, crucially, without repeating the problem of massive war debts that had so complicated international relations after World War I. The idea of Lend-Lease itself belonged to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He explained it with a simple but powerful metaphor. A man told us to Imagine our neighbor's house is on fire and we have a garden hose. He said we wouldn't sell him the hose while it's on fire. We'd give him the hose so he could put out the fire. And when the fire was out, he'd return the hose to us or replace it if it was damaged. Lend-Lease thus allowed the U.S. government to sell, transfer, barter, lease, or otherwise make available defense materials to any country whose defense was deemed vital to the security of the United States. But let's look at the basic principles and objectives of one of these was supporting the Allies without entering the war. Also in the early stages of the war, Britain was the only country actively fighting Nazi Germany, but its financial resources were running low. Lend-Lease allowed Britain to receive critical supplies without paying for them in cash, which was impossible. After the USSR entered the war and suffered heavy losses, Lend-Lease became a lifeline for the Soviet Union as well. There was also the avoidance of the war debts of World War I. In fact, after World War I, European countries were saddled with huge debts to the United States, which led to economic and political squabbles. Roosevelt and his administration were keen to avoid a repeat of this situation, so Lend-Lease provided flexible terms for repayment. Goods could be returned after the war, or payment could be in the form of benefits to the United States in the post-war settlement. This gave Washington considerable influence in shaping the post-war world order. But even though the aid went to the Allies, orders for these goods were placed with American factories. This provided a huge flow of contracts for U.S. industry, which was vital in helping to recover from the Great Depression. You may ask, what was the price of all this? But I will tell you that the total cost of the Lend-Lease supplies was a whopping $50.1 billion. This is about $760 billion at current prices, taking into account inflation. This was a grandiose act of international aid, unprecedented in its scale. Now let's look at which countries received this aid. The first, of course, was Great Britain. The British received huge amounts of weapons, equipment, and food. They received various Spitfire and Hurricane fighters. Although Britain produced its own aircraft, American fighters, the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt, were also supplied in significant numbers, strengthening the Royal Air Force. But especially critical were the 50 destroyers given to Britain under the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. Thousands of trucks, jeeps, and artillery tractors kept the British Army mobile. But much of Britain's food supply during the war came from the United States, helping to prevent famine. Strategic raw materials such as steel, aluminum, and oil were also supplied. The second state to receive aid was the SSCF. In fact, supplies to the Soviet Union began after the German invasion in June 1941 and became especially intense after the opening of the Northern Sea convoys. These vehicles provided the Red Army with unprecedented mobility, allowing troops, artillery, and supplies to be moved more quickly, which was essential on the vast expanses of the Eastern Front. The USSR also received over 14,000 aircraft, including Bell P-39 Airacobra and P-63 King Cobra fighters, as well as bombers. More than 1,900 steam locomotives and 11,000 carriages were delivered to the Soviet railways, which significantly increased their capacity. Also, aluminum, copper, explosives, high-octane gasoline, telephone cables, radios, all this was critically important for the Soviet industry and army. And of course, a huge amount of stewed meat, butter, egg powder, and other food products helped feed the soldiers and civilians. But it is worth mentioning that China and France also received significant assistance. In fact, without Lend-Lease, the Allies, especially Britain and the USSR, would have faced much greater difficulties and perhaps even defeat. It allowed them to continue fighting and hold the fronts, while the United States built up its own military strength and prepared for direct involvement in the fighting. Although Lend-Lease was an aid program, it also became a powerful engine for the American economy. The program provided huge, long-term orders to thousands of American companies. These were not just one-time contracts, but a steady stream of orders that allowed companies to plan for expansion and investment. Of course, production for Lend-Lease required a colossal amount of resources and labor. This contributed to the further increase in industrial production and supported full employment, ensuring high incomes for the population. And in order to fulfill these orders, American companies expanded their factories, built new ones, and introduced more efficient technologies. These modernized and expanded capacities remained after the war, becoming the basis for the post-war industrial leadership of the United States. And in exchange for American aid, the Allies also provided various services and goods. For example, Great Britain provided bases for American troops and ships, intelligence data, medical services, and some equipment. The USSR, in turn, transferred samples of German technology and some types of raw materials. Although the cost of reverse Lend-Lease was significantly less, it also represented a valuable resource. It is worth saying that Lend-Lease became a powerful tool of American diplomacy and geopolitics. It strengthened the U.S. position as the leader of the free world and gave Washington leverage over the post-war world order. After the war, the issue of paying off the remaining Lend-Lease debts became an important element of negotiations with former allies, especially with the USSR. Thus, the Lend-Lease Act was not just an act of charity, but more of a strategic economic investment that not only saved the Allies, but also became a powerful catalyst for American industry, providing it with colossal volumes of production and laying the foundation for U.S. dominance in the world economy for many decades. Well, we will move on and consider the third factor, namely state financing and investment. It is known that in the conditions of the Great Depression, private capital was too depleted and cautious to provide the investments necessary for the war. That is why the American government assumed the role of the main investor and the engine of economic growth, which was an unprecedented state intervention in the economy, which in essence put into practice the principles of Keynesianism. The amount of government spending during the war was simply incredible, far exceeding all previous expenditures, even under the New Deal. Government spending as a share of US GDP, which in 1940 was only 8.8%, had skyrocketed to 43.6% by 1944. This meant that almost half of all goods and services produced in the country were directly or indirectly used for the war effort. It is worth mentioning that the government invested billions of dollars in building completely new factories, as well as in expanding and modernizing existing production facilities. By some estimates, almost 70% of all capital investment in the U.S. manufacturing industry between 1940 and 1945 was funded by the government. This helped to rapidly increase the production of strategic materials such as steel, aluminum, magnesium, synthetic rubber, and aviation fuel, which were in acute shortage. For example, the government invested heavily in building aluminum plants and synthetic rubber plants, which were virtually non-existent in the U.S. before the war. The government entered into very large contracts with thousands of private companies, guaranteeing the purchase of their products. These contracts reduced the financial risks for businesses and encouraged companies to invest in expanding production, since they were confident that their products would sell. This created a stable and predictable demand, which was vital to mobilizing the economy. Also, many contracts were made on a cost-plus basis, where the government paid all of the company's production costs plus a fixed profit. This motivated companies to quickly ramp up production without worrying about losses, but sometimes led to inefficiencies. However, under extreme time pressure, this model allowed production to start up quickly. I want to say that even in some strategically important sectors, the government created its own corporations to manage production and resource distribution. In addition to the already mentioned Rubber Reserve Company, others were created, such as the Defense Plant Corporation, which built and owned thousands of industrial facilities, leasing them to private companies. This demonstrated the state's readiness to directly control and manage economic processes in order to achieve victory. And in order to partially finance the very large military expenditures, the government significantly increased taxes. I wear it, but I did it in such a way as to ensure relative social justice and the involvement of the population. For example, income tax rates were raised, especially for high incomes. Before the war, only about 4 million Americans paid income taxes. By 1945, that number had risen to over 42 million. For the highest incomes, the top rate could reach as much as 94%. This was done not only to raise money, but to curb inflation by taking excess money out of the economy and to create a sense that everyone was contributing to the greater good. And the companies that made huge profits from military contracts were subject to special taxes on excess profits. This was intended to prevent unjust enrichment from the war and to ensure a more equitable distribution of the cargo. And finally, B. In 1943, the withholding tax system was introduced, whereby employers began to deduct income taxes from employees' salaries before they were paid. This made tax collection much easier and more efficient, and also made millions of citizens who had previously not paid taxes aware of their financial responsibility to the state. But even with the significant increase in tax revenues, the scale of expenditure was such that the government had to borrow heavily, which led to a sharp increase in the national debt. It increased from about $50 billion in 1940 to $260 billion in 1945. This was more than a five-fold increase, which at the time seemed like a really big number. However, unlike many other countries, the United States financed a significant portion of its spending from its own domestic sources, which reduced its dependence on foreign creditors. Despite the huge government expenditures and the reduction in the production of civilian goods, the government managed to control inflation relatively successfully. This was facilitated not only by high taxes and the issuance of war bonds, but also by strict price and wage controls imposed by the Office of Price Administration. The OPA set maximum prices for most goods and services and regulated wages to prevent inflation. A system of rationing was even introduced, which allowed for a fair distribution of scarce goods, such as sugar, coffee, meat, gasoline, and tires, among the population. Also provided a prime example of how massive government spending could not only finance the war effort, but also lift an economy out of a deep recession. John Maynard Keynes's theories, advocating government intervention to stimulate demand, found their ultimate validation in the American wartime economy. Massive injections of government spending effectively acted as a final stimulus, soaking up excess labor and capital that the private sector had been unable to utilize during the Depression. Thus, public finance and investment during World War II marked a turning point in American economic policy. It demonstrated that government could be a powerful engine of growth and an effective coordinator in times of crisis, laying the groundwork for a more active role for government in the economy in the post-war period, and changing ideas about the possibilities of fiscal policy. I think you are interested to hear about the fourth trick, namely attraction of labor force. It consisted of mandatory mobilization and redistribution of labor force. The call of millions of men to the front created a huge labor shortage in industry and agriculture, which forced society to reconsider traditional roles and open up new opportunities for those who had previously been excluded from the labor market. By 1942, it became obvious that without attracting new groups of the population to production, it would be impossible to fulfill military orders. Two main groups of the population played a decisive role there. Before the war, most married women traditionally did not work outside the home or held low-paying service jobs such as secretaries and salespeople. The war changed this picture dramatically. More than 6 million women entered the workforce for the first time, taking positions in factories, shipyards, transportation, and other traditionally male-dominated industries. And the iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, with her rolled-up sleeve and determined expression, became a symbol of the millions of American women who worked in munitions factories, built airplanes and ships, and repaired machinery. The share of women in the U.S. labor force increased from 27% to 37% by 1945. Women worked as welders, mechanics, truck drivers, dispatchers, and even in scientific laboratories, proving their ability to perform complex and difficult work. For example, at Boeing's Seattle plant, the proportion of women workers rose from 10% to 50% by the end of the war. Women assembled the B-17 and B-29 bombers, but even though African Americans had already served in the military and worked in factories before the war, they were often denied high-paying, skilled jobs because of racial discrimination. However, the acute labor shortage, as well as civil rights activism such as Philip Randolph's March on Washington, which threatened Roosevelt unless discrimination in the defense industry was stopped, forced the government to take action. Also in 1941, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 88022, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, religion, or nationality in the defense industry and government agencies. This was the first step by the federal government to combat racial discrimination in the labor force. So thousands of African Americans migrated from the South to the industrial centers of the North and West, such as Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles, to find work in military factories. Their share of the defense workforce increased significantly. Programs such as Bracero allowed thousands of Mexican workers to come to the United States to work in agriculture and on the railroads. Indians also found work in military factories and served in the army. And it was this mass mobilization that allowed not only to maintain, but also to significantly increase the volume of production, despite the fact that more than 16 million men were called up for military service. Also, new workers, many of whom had no production experience, quickly mastered new skills, and labor productivity steadily increased. This was facilitated by various large-scale training programs. The government and companies invested in accelerated and massive training and retraining programs. Training centers were created right at the factories, where recruits were taught to use complex equipment, read blueprints, and perform precise operations. There was also the introduction of new production methods. Thus, the improvement of conveyor lines, standardization of parts, and modular assembly continued. This allowed complex production processes to be decomposed into simpler, more easily mastered tasks, which facilitated the integration of new workers. Of course, there was also patriotic motivation. It was the feeling of participation in a common cause, a high patriotic spirit, and the understanding that their work directly affected the outcome of the war that were powerful incentives for workers to give their best and be highly productive. But it was the increased employment and often higher wages, especially compared to the Depression, that led to a significant increase in overall household income. Despite rationing and shortages of consumer goods, this contributed to a significant increase in savings, which later fueled the post-war consumer boom. But the influx of new populations into the workforce should not be overlooked, because it had social and economic consequences that shaped post-war America. An example of this was the changing role of women in society, as experience in manufacturing gave women a new degree of economic independence and also changed public perceptions of their capabilities and role in society. This was an important step towards future liberation and the fight for gender equality, which would intensify in the following decades. Women proved their ability to do any job, and this in turn destroyed many prejudices. But the economic success of African Americans in the war industry, as well as their service in the armed forces, albeit in isolated units, led to a growing awareness of the injustice of racial inequality and discrimination. The war laid the foundation for a powerful civil rights movement that gained momentum in the 1950s and 1960s, as African Americans who had fought for freedom abroad returned home and demanded it for themselves. And after the war, the United States had a huge pool of skilled and experienced workers. Many of them learned new skills right on the job. These people were one of the main reasons for the strong post-war economic growth and the United States' leadership in world industry. Thus, the labor mobilization was not only an economic change, but also a major social change. It helped win the war and forever changed American society and the labor market. It opened the way to new equality and opportunity for millions of people. And finally, we come to the last factor, which was the issuance of war bonds. This program was multifunctional. It helped finance the incredibly large military expenditures, it helped fight inflation, and, last but not least, it united the nation, involving every citizen in the common cause of victory. In reality, war bonds were securities sold by the government to individuals and corporations. By purchasing a bond, citizens lent money to the government, which was obligated to repay it with interest after a certain period of time, usually about 10 years. Bonds were sold through a variety of channels, such as banks, post offices, schools, churches, and even directly to businesses, where a portion of wages could be automatically withheld to purchase the bonds. Now let's look at the main goals of this rather interesting campaign, and the first was financing military expenses. Of course, they had to raise the necessary funds to pay for the most expensive war in history. The government could not fully cover the costs through taxes and throwing away money, so attracting the savings of the population was critical. The second goal was to combat inflation, because with the outbreak of war, incomes rose significantly due to full employment. But the volume of consumer goods on the market declined as production was reoriented to military needs. This created strong inflationary pressure. Too much money was chasing too few goods. The sale of bonds allowed the excess money to be tied up in the hands of the population, removing it from circulation and thus reducing consumer demand, which helped to curb price increases. This was the key mechanism of monetary control. And the last one was building patriotism and national unity. The bond campaign was closely tied to a powerful propaganda campaign urging citizens to invest in victory, buy victory, and save democracy. Buying bonds became an act of patriotism, a way for every American, even those who couldn't go to the front, to feel part of a great cause. And there were various slogans that said, "Every dollar you save is a bullet for your son." And they were common. I would also like to say that the war bond campaign was incredible in its scale and effectiveness, reaching virtually every layer of American society. During the war, approximately $185 billion was raised through the sale of war bonds. This amount covered approximately 2/3 of the nation's total military expenditures, demonstrating how successful the strategy was. Much of this was collected in 8 nationwide war loans, each of which set ambitious but usually exceeded fundraising goals. There was also mass participation of the population. Almost 85 million Americans, more than half the country's population at the time, bought at least one bond. People bought bonds in denominations ranging from $18.75, which would be worth $25 in 10 years, to thousands of dollars, putting every penny aside to support the war effort. School children saved pennies to buy savings stamps that they then exchanged for bonds. And celebrities like Frank Sinatra, Bob Hope, and Bette Davis went on the advertising campaign trail, holding rallies and concerts to urge Americans to buy bonds. At that time, there was also thoughtful marketing. The government used all available channels as best it could: radio, Disney movies, films with appeals, posters, newspapers. Bonds were sold at workplaces through a system of automatic deductions from wages, which made the purchase process easy and regular. Of course, the sale of war bonds had several important and long-term economic effects, the first of which was financial stability. By containing large demand and inflation, bonds helped maintain a relatively stable economy in the face of massive government spending and shortages of consumer goods. This was critical to preventing hyperinflation, which could have undermined the war effort. The culture was also formed savings, for example. The campaign encouraged Americans to save and be financially disciplined. Millions of families who had never had significant savings before now had them in the form of bonds. This created significant pent-up demand and a financial safety net in the population. And finally, there was the post-war consumer surge. It is well known that after the war ended, as the economy began to turn to the peaceful side, millions of Americans began to pay off their bonds. These freed-up funds became a powerful source of consumer demand. Together with payments to veterans under the GI Bill, which provided benefits for education, home loans, and unemployment benefits, these savings stimulated an unprecedented post-war economic surge. People rushed to buy cars, the production of which had already resumed by that time, to build houses, which led to a boom even in the suburbs, to buy household appliances and enjoy a peaceful life, having the means to do so. Thus, war bonds became not just a tool for financing war, but also an ingenious mechanism for economic regulation and social cohesion. They helped stabilize the economy in the face of unprecedented challenges and paved the way for the greatest period of prosperity in U.S. history. And finally, I want to sum up some of our information. It should be said that World War II, despite its horrors and incredible human toll, was a unique booster for the American economy. The 5 economic tricks we have discussed, the massive mobilization of industry, the Lend-Lease Act, government financing and investment, mass labor recruitment, and the issuance of war bonds, were not flukes but part of a deliberate and dynamic strategy. Their combined effect lifted the United States out of the depths of the Great Depression and propelled the country to the pinnacle of global economic and political influence. It must be said that the industrial mobilization transformed the United States into an unprecedented arsenal of democracy, capable of producing military equipment in quantities no other country could dream of. This not only ensured the Allied victory, but also laid the foundation for America's post-war industrial superiority. And the Lend-Lease Act was a brilliant geopolitical and economic instrument. It allowed the Allies to continue the fight when their resources were running low, while providing stable and massive orders for American industry, stimulating its growth and development. Of course, government financing and investment were the main engine of this transformation process. The government took risks and directed huge amounts of money into key industries that the private sector alone could not have done, especially after that terrible depression. This demonstrated the effectiveness of large-scale policy and changed the role of government in the economy. Of course, bringing in new labor, including women and minorities, solved the labor shortage problem and contributed to significant productivity gains. It also had profound and lasting social consequences, changing traditional gender and racial roles, laying the groundwork for future movements for civil rights and equality. Well, the war bond campaign not only effectively financed the war effort without causing excessive inflation, but it also brought the nation together and created huge savings among the population that became a powerful fuel for the post-war consumer boom. And when the war ended, much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins, their economies destroyed and their industries decimated. Meanwhile, the US economy emerged from the conflict intact and greatly strengthened. The dollar had become the world's dominant reserve currency, replacing the British pound. American goods, from automobiles to appliances, flooded world markets. The US middle class experienced unprecedented growth thanks to full employment, high wages, and affordable programs like the GI Bill. The Second World War changed the United States completely. It not only ended the crisis of the Great Depression, but also vividly demonstrated to the world the incredible strength of American industry. The ability to quickly mobilize and innovate. Mass production of weapons and advanced technologies brought the economy to a new level, making the country the undisputed world leader for many decades to come. Thus, the wartime mobilization of labor became the key to victory and the dramatic changes in American society. Millions of people gained new opportunities and valuable skills that they had not had before. The disappearance of unemployment opened the door to those who had been unable to find work for years, including women and minorities. Women took up industrial jobs in droves, such as welding and assembly work in factories, and African Americans moved to major cities to work in factories, which became the first step in redefining traditional racial and gender roles. Not only did this provide for the needs of the war, but it also laid the foundation for future equality and significantly changed the social structure, contributing to the subsequent civil rights movements and the formation of a new image of the American dream.